Hi, I'm Scott from Nomad Solar. I'm going to go through some common tools you're going to need for your upcoming either solar build in your RV or all of your electrical in a van or skoolie build. So the very first tool that I'm going to say you're going to want to go pick up for electrical side is going to be a really good pair of Knippers. You can get by with cheap ones, but they wear out quickly. The teeth end up chipping, and it really it wears out on your hands, especially if you're going to spend long days doing these electrical jobs. And if you want something to last you a really, really long time, now would be a good time to invest in a halfway decent tool. So this set is a set of Knippers that I've been using for well over 15 years. I was using them back when I was a mechanic, before I was even doing all the electrical things. This is a really good set to buy. If not that set, buy Kleins, buy something halfway decent that has a halfway hardened material for the cutting edge. The number two thing I would say you're going to want is a pair of strippers, but specifically for me, I use auto strippers. So the great thing about these is you can one hand strip a lot of wires, and you can strip wires quickly and accurately. These things were ridiculously expensive when I bought them 15 years ago. I think these were $200 15 years ago. Now you can pick up a set of Kleins that work absolutely fantastic. That's a high quality set for right around $30. Once again, this is something you will use for the rest of your life as long as you take care of them. I think a set of auto strippers are absolutely invaluable for when you're getting into electrical projects. Good crimpers. Crimpers are something everyone's got 2 or 3 sets of really crappy crimpers that came in like a multi-kit set that has some really crappy terminal ends and a cheap set of crimpers. And those are the number one issues I find with people's builds, are poor crimping and using the wrong terminal ends. So getting a good set of crimpers that's ratcheting crimpers, so they will not release unless you fully crimp. It's one good way to know you have a solid connection. And the teeth on these things are much wider, so you get a much wider crimp. Therefore, you can use terminal ends that have a much wider piece of metal for the crimping area. These will save you a lot of heartache down the road. And like I said, they don't release unless you crimp all the way, so you know you have a solid connection. These Kleins, once again, I think they're about 30 bucks. It's a set that'll last you a lifetime. The teeth are replaceable too. So if you end up getting into needing to crimp MC4 connectors, those are open or uninsulated open barrel is what they're called. And there's a set of crimp teeth that go right in here specifically for that. So you won't have MC4s pulling out, which is another really, really common thing that I find when people are having issues with their systems. This one's going to sound really simple, but a multi-screwdriver. When you're doing electrical work, nothing's super high torque. So I don't feel the need to have dedicated screwdrivers for everything. And I like having one standing by, because you're going to be flipping this thing around from large to small Phillips, from large to small flatheads. And it's nice to have all the screwdrivers you're going to need in one tool sitting right next to you. Now you can go to Home Depot, and I think you can buy one of these for $2 or $3. The metal on those are pretty poor. They'll get by, and if you buy a couple of them or buy one a year, it doesn't really matter. They're $3, and that's fine. This one's a Century Mechanical. I've had, once again, for 15 years. And this one's lasted. The Klein one I have, same thing. It's got really good metal, so the bits don't chew apart and strip off. So for me, it makes more sense to buy a $10 tool I'm going to have for decades, opposed to constantly having to run down and buy a $3 tool. But you make your own decision there. A multi-screwdriver is really nice on these installs. In that same camp, once again, nothing super high torque. I'm a stickler for the right tool when it comes to mechanical, because if not, you end up stripping things out and making your job way harder. But a good crescent wrench. And this one is just an 8-inch Klein. I don't care what the brands are, as long as it's pretty solid and doesn't have a lot of wiggle. Unfortunately, the really cheap Taiwanese stuff that comes in kits, those tend to strip stuff pretty well. So just buy one good 8-inch. Go buy a Craftsman, or even the Cobalt or Huskies aren't bad. The Kleins are really, really good. This one is way older than 15 years. This one was my grandfather's, and this one's probably 40 years old, and I still use it every single install. Every one of these tools I use every single install. A multimeter. Now, I'm not going to say this one specifically, although I've had this one for 20 years. In May, it'll be 20 years exactly, and this has been my full-time multimeter through multiple careers, multiple job fields. This was incredibly expensive at the time. This was a $300 multimeter. Most people do not need this. You can get away with, I mean, I've used $3 ones from Harbor Freight to get the job done. I would recommend, if you're going to be working on your own stuff from here going forward, you buy something a little better. Once again, Klein's another decent brand. Flukes are really, really good, but you're going to pay for those. The big things you want to have on these for function is you want volts, both DC, AC. You want ohms resistance. I like having an audible ohms resistance setting. That's really good for when you're checking fuses fast. You can just listen for a beep and you know that you're getting continuity. And then another thing you want is to make sure you can test amps of some sort. So multimeters like this are only good up to about 10 amps. If you need to test higher than that, they have what's called a clamp meter. It actually clamps around the wire and then reads it. That would be what you want in that case. I'll put a recommendation up for a halfway decent Klein. It'll probably be in the $30 to $50 range. If you're trying to buy a tool that's going to last you a really long time, I would go with that. If you need to go cheaper because you're on an extreme budget, just make sure whatever you get has the functions that I stated below. Also look at how long the lead ends are. So for your probes, the cheap ones come with really, really short ones, and it makes it almost impossible to work with. So even though a tool is, you know, cheap and cost effective, if it's not going to do what you need it to do, it's just throwing away money anyways. So make sure it has the settings you need, and make sure it has long enough lead ends to do what you need. Hydraulic crimper. A lot of people will, especially if they're on a budget, they'll argue against this one. I'm going to tell you exactly why, and I actually have a video on crimps as well that'll tell you why. Those hydraulic crimpers save you. It saves you from having a catastrophic failure in the future. A lot of people want to either use a vise and try to crimp big terminal lugs for, you know, 2-aught and 4-aught cables. And I've seen that done with some success, but way more often than not, when I see a terminal that's crimped on a vise, which is just squeezed together, they fail. And they fail by the wire coming out of the terminal. So the reason you have a wire that thick is it's carrying a high amount of amperage, right? That's the only reason to run big, thick cable. So now you have a high amperage live wire floating around in your rig. That's what causes sparks. That's what causes heat. That's what causes the things that nobody wants to happen. So for $40, and this is a knockoff, right? The name brand high-end versions of these, they're $200 and $300. That's out of reach for most people and doesn't make sense unless you're in an industry where you're going to use this all the time. I'm in an industry that I use it all the time. I still use an Amazon one. They're $45-ish, and they come with a different die set going anywhere from 10 gauge all the way up to 4-aught. These are really important to get really good crimps. There's a cheaper route. They have a hammer type. You can go with those, but what I'll say about that, if you're working into an existing system, you have to pull whatever wire you're going to crimp with out of the system to do that. Sometimes that's not feasible. So for a $45 tool that you're going to use probably multiple times during, well, you're definitely going to use it multiple times during your build, but multiple times after that build too, either helping other people, fixing your own system, or adding on to your system, because we hardly ever get it right the first go around. I think that's a worthwhile tool to get. Next is, and these are super cheap, so a razor knife. Now, this is the one I use every day on installs. It's just a box cutter, a regular old razor knife. But what you use this for is stripping the casing, the insulative casing on big cables. So 2-aught, 4-aught, you don't have auto strippers for that. And knife blades tend to be too wide. I always carry a really sharp pocket knife with me too, but they just don't really work well for doing electrical work. These really thin razor blades, they work great. So you're just going to spin around, cut a slice, and you're going to peel off that coating. And if you don't want to buy something like this, that's fine. Do you have one of these laying around? These were given out free for the 70s all the way through the 90s, right? And they're not so commonplace anymore, but these box cutters, I used one of these for years and years and years doing electrical work, and I still use this one occasionally. I have a preference of the other one, but if you want to buy one of these, they're $1 on Amazon. They're really cheap. Not everything that works well has to be expensive, but I like that it has a razor blade. It's a very, very thin blade, and there's not very much blade there to use, so you're not going to cut super deep. If you do slip and nick yourself, you're probably not going to go deep enough to really hurt yourself. And then the last thing that I use on every single install is a micro torch. So this is a Burns-O-Matic standard micro torch. I use this for heat shrinking mostly, but also use it for soldering. And it's one of those things that makes it move really quick. If you have access to 110 power during your build, like when I was in a mechanic shop, I didn't use these near as much. I used a heat gun. So heat guns work really good for all your heat shrink and all that stuff. But when you're working either off-grid or you just need to be really mobile and not carry a power cord, that's when these micro torches come in super handy. Now, 3 things I would add that aren't necessities, but I think are really nice and they don't cost that much. So the strippers that I showed you earlier, these are really good for your 12 volt side. Anything stranded, and they do work for solid core. What's better for solid core, if you're running Romex for 110 side, you're doing a lot of Romex work, is a set of strippers like this. And this is something much closer to what you probably already have in your garage. And if you have a set of these, that's great. Keep these for the 110 side. What's good about these is they strip solid core a little bit faster, in my opinion, because it's got a way thicker way thinner insulation on it. And then it has these holes that are in it that are actually meant to insert in the solid core and twist, so you make a hoop to put on your 110 outlets. Now, for a bus or a van build or anything moving, still not going to recommend doing that anyways. I'll do a video in the future on how I recommend to do the 110 side to make sure it's vibration proof. But if you're doing anything standing still, if you're doing a cabin off-grid, or say you're doing a park model that's never going to move, this would be the tool, because you're going to use standard Romex. Another optional tool that I use a lot and is super cheap, medical forceps. And there's probably a better technical term, but I'm not a doctor, I'm an electrician. So I use these, they ratchet down there at the bottom, they stay clamped. I use these to either grab wires out of a tight area and pull them back, and that way I can let these go and it holds them there, and I know I can retrieve the wire before it goes back into a hole. I use these for clamping wires together if I'm going to solder, specifically if I'm going to solder with that micro torch. I have a little hole right here in the center where I can concentrate the heat, and this actually becomes a heat sink and takes some of that heat instead of letting it travel up the wire. These things have been really handy. I have no idea where I got them. They showed up in my toolbox 20 years ago, and I've been using them for all sorts of stuff. You can find these things for $2 or $3 all over the place. I'll put a link in Amazon to a set of them or something like that. And then the last thing, and this is optional, this is my tool roll. Having tools close to you when you're doing a job is really important. Having tools close to you that are organized is even more important. So each one of these pockets has a different function. So I know if I need crimpers, they're in the bottom. If I need cutters, they're in the bottom. If I need connectors, they're at the top. And I have a system in there, but I can walk up to any job with a tool roll and all my stuff's there in one location. This is a Bucket Boss brand, really inexpensive for what it is. And I've been beating the snot out of that exact one. And that's my hardest used one of those for 3 years, and it hasn't failed yet. And for the money that they cost, I think they're really, really worthwhile. Now, there's an Atlas 46 or 26 version of it. It's a military's version, the same thing. It's $300. I think I paid 25-ish for around there for this Bucket Boss tool roll. At that price, I think it's really important. So I have one for electrical stuff. I have one for all my leather working stuff. I have one for mechanical tools. Actually, I have two for mechanical tools. One for, you know, wrenches, socket stuff, and then one for specialty tools. They're cheap enough where they make a lot of sense in the traveling lifestyle. They fold your tools really, really small. They can pack away easy that way. And then they don't make sense because everything's all rolled up. Or they don't make any sound, rather. They make tons of sense and no sound. When you roll them all up, you don't have to hear tools banging around in the back. So these are my recommendations for every electrical kit should have this. Some of these are a little bit more high-end options, or you can spend more. I still recommend buying like good crimpers. Those are worth the money, man. These are $30 crimpers opposed to $10 crimpers, and that $20 is going to save you so much headache down the road. So I think there's places where you spend money, and then I think there's places you save money, like batteries. And that'll be another video. We can talk about batteries in the future and where to save money there. And same with solar panels. But spend money on some tools and take your time and learn it, because it's something you're going to do for the rest of your life. All right, once again, I'm Scott with Nomad Solar. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. If you have any future video requests, leave them down in the comments. Thank you, guys.